It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Center, as well as on the migration network of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, which co-sponsors the event. Today's lecture is part of a series organized by SepaRope, which is a three-year research project on separation of powers in 21st century European Union. And the project includes the University of Amsterdam, as well as the University of Helsinki and the University of Gothenburg. So I'm very excited to introduce the speaker of today. We have today Florian Trauner. He will present his talk titled EU Decision-Making on Migration Control and the Return of Irregular Migrants. So Florian is the director of the Research Center for Migration, Diversity and Justice at the Free University of Brussels. And he also holds a Jean Monnet Chair Expand, Explaining Resilience in EU Justice and Home Affairs. As many of you might know, his research interests center around European integration, and he's written quite a lot about that, and also on decision-making processes, and particularly on justice and home affairs. So today, he will tell us a little bit more about what's going on at the EU level in terms of decision-making on return of irregular migrants, on readmission, and also on the new return sponsorships that have come up during the discussions on the new pact on migration and asylum. So we will have a presentation by Florian, and then we'll make sure also to have enough time for questions and answers. And my colleague Saskia Bonjour will chair the discussion afterwards. So Florian, the floor is yours. And many thanks again for coming.
Davide, dear colleagues, many thanks for inviting me. It's a big pleasure to engage with the SepaRope project and to give you a bit of the insight as well on my research and on the research of others on the field of return, control of irregular migration, but I will primarily focus on the return field. Right. Okay, so this is a bit the structure that I'm going to implement in my lecture. So I'm first looking, okay, what are the key elements of the EU's policy on return, few elements, and then I will try to go onto the negotiation dynamics within this field, trying to make more or less three parts on this. On the one hand, looking on the EU's negotiations on return and readmission, in particular with Eastern and Southeastern neighbors, then with the rest of the world, basically outside the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe, the European Union is increasingly going for more informal readmission arrangements than readmission agreements. So I'm looking a bit on this aspect. And finally, I'm shifting to this EU internal dynamics of decision-making that are ongoing right now in the context of the new pact on migration, on asylum and migration. In particular, the idea to have return sponsorships within the European Union. So that's a bit the things that you will hear from me in the next 30 to 40 minutes. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Otherwise, we can discuss directly thereafter. Okay, so what's the background of return policy? Return policy is increasingly seen as being a central element of the EU's migration management more widely. Policymakers basically put forward the position that the whole migration management regime loses credibility if migrants coming on fake protection claims or in an irregular way cannot be returned to their point of departure. So there is also discussion if returning migrants that overstayed or come irregularly is not part of customary international law. But that said, return procedures cannot be implemented if states of destinations and states of origin or transits are not cooperating. But we see more widely, that there is basically a kind of a deportation term, as it was called in the literature, taking place in the management of migration. Return is taking a very important place in the so-called management of migration across the Western Hemisphere. So it's not something that is necessarily confined to the European settings. You see the similar things in other OECD states. So what's the evolution? We can see that the first kind of interstate agreements that date back a bit to post-Napoleon times. So you had Prussia sign first interstate agreements on readmission with other German states in 1818, 1819. Within Europe, bilateral agreements on admission, non-admission proliferated post-World War II. They often included provisions on return. In Europe, they became really also very dominant in the context of the EU's turn towards Eastern enlargement. So the Central and Eastern European states, they were supposed to become safe third countries, including return provisions. But this was mostly within Europe. If we talk nowadays about the EU's return policy, it concerns mostly as well the EU's interaction with third countries. Treaty of Amsterdam was here a milestone. It created legal competences for the EU to sign readmission agreements and also to legislate in the migration field. You have different elements composing here. You have on the one hand the return directive. The return directive creates common standards, common procedures on the return of irregular migration. You have a lot of Frontex operational support. In particular, nowadays, with the empowerment of Frontex, Frontex is supposed to get up to 10,000 border guards by 2027. There should be a very substantial return unit within Frontex. So Frontex is getting a relevant actor in the field as well. And finally, you have the EU's readmission agreement. Readmission agreement is something that is very central in the EU's interaction with third countries, and that basically should operationalize the whole field here. So before I go here, this is already the kind of introduction. So I will look how the negotiations on readmission agreements have evolved in primarily starting with southeastern and eastern neighbors. As with so many aspects of the EU's external relations, the Western Balkans have constituted a kind of a zone in which the EU has tried to test certain tools, certain policies, and this was not much different in the field of readmission and return too. So let's spend a slide very briefly. What are readmission agreements? So readmission agreements basically govern procedural provisions regarding return procedure. So a state defines that a migrant is no longer eligible to stay. He or she gets an order to leave. But if the person is not willing to leave, then a forcible return procedure may kick in. And the readmission agreement governs the procedures between the state authorities of the European state and the state of destination. So there are relatively complicated negotiations, because the primarily direction of return tends to be from Europe to third countries. So third countries are often hesitant to take migrants back. And then the EU also tried in its readmission agreements as a standard provision to include that it should not only concern the nationals of the partner countries, but also transit migrants. So there is a clause on transit migration that should also be targeted by the EU readmission agreements. And here, third countries are often very reluctant to go along. Similarly, with this accelerated procedure for persons apprehended in the border region, in which states are relatively reluctant to go along with the EU's priorities. Challenging in general is always, and also part of the negotiations is, what are the kind of proofs of an individual's nationality, the proof of a migration route, what is evidence here. There is always a risk that if the EU signs readmission agreements, the third country will sign itself readmission agreements with countries further in the direction of the countries of origin. And this may trigger chain readmissions of the migrant. And even if the EU then possibly ensure a certain respect for the rights of this national in the direct readmission of the countries, it's often very difficult to verify that certain minimum rights standards are respected if this person is further readmitted. And certainly then there is the challenge of reintegration, return migrants in the home country, even if they are from their own nationality. We have seen here studies, Kruse has done some studies, for instance, in Albania, but you have other studies on Afghanistan, that migrants being readmitted tend to face a real, not only a social stigma, but also a real challenge to being reintegrated in their home countries. So readmission agreements are kind of contested agreements that are difficult to negotiate for the European Union. And given that they are so difficult to negotiate, the European Union started to accept for certain third countries as a trade-off. And the trade-off was to link readmission agreements more closely to the visa domain and to promote visa facilitation agreements in exchange for it. This was not something that came easily for member state governments. We can see, if you trace back in the early 2000s, the negotiations. So post-Treaty of Amsterdam, the EU had the competences, the Commission was given the mandate to negotiate. And then very quickly, the member states asked, but why do you not sign readmission agreements? And the Commission said, look, we cannot convince the third partner country the third country to cooperate with us. They ask for some incentives, they ask for some compensation. And in the end, the Council allowed the Commission to negotiate readmission and visa facilitation jointly. The first country of which was the Russian Federation, then Ukraine, but it became really very comprehensively and quickly tested, in particular in the Western Balkans. So this was one reason. The second reason was back then also linked to the Eastern enlargement. So in the Eastern enlargement, the EU transferred its justice and home affairs acquis to the then candidate countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And it was seen that those states that had a relatively liberalized mobility regime, let's say between Poland and Ukraine, between Romania and Moldova, that this Eastern enlargement installs a kind of a Schengen paper wall in Eastern Europe. So then they said visa facilitation should mitigate the negative side effects of the Eastern enlargement, and visa facilitation became a kind of a objective as such. So in this region, visa and readmission became more closely interlinked and was seen as a kind of a standard nexus. And you can see these are all the readmission agreements that the EU has signed so far, 18. You can see that first the readmission agreements, the negotiating mandate was in particular in certain Western and Eastern European, Western Balkan and Eastern European states earlier than the visa facilitation agreements, but eventually in this neighbors it was more closely linked and the agreements were signed together. So the nexus was really closely interlinked and widely accepted by the states, basically. You had some other states, Hong Kong, Macau are a kind of special cases. And then you had Pakistan and Sri Lanka who signed readmission agreements without visa facilitation agreements, already indicating there that the EU was very reluctant to use visa facilitation in its negotiation with third countries outside Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. And indeed, in Eastern Europe, readmission and visa facilitation was only the beginning for these third countries. They said visa facilitation is very nice, but if we want more, and this is a fully liberal visa regime. So they wanted to travel without any papers to ask beforehand. And eventually the European Union accepted this, but it linked it to very demanding visa-free dialogues. So in the visa-free dialogues, there was not only monitored that the readmission is really comprehensively implemented, they also had to fulfill a range of other conditions. They had to strengthen the border management, but it was also conditions related, for instance, to the integration or to the treatment of Roma minorities or other minority issues, fundamental rights issue. For some period, and you could see that, for instance, in Ukrainian case, it basically lasted almost 10 years. The EU had a very strong incentives to interfere in the justice and home affairs sectors of these third states. But in a way, in Eastern Europe, this became a kind of an accepted deal in the migration field. You cooperate on the return of irregular migration, you cooperate on border control and others, and in exchange, our own citizens get facilitated, completely liberalized visa regime, visa travel to the European Union. And the EU did not stop basically to monitor this deal once full visa liberalization was achieved, but they created kind of post-visa liberalization monitoring mechanism. It also created in the beginning, 2010, you see here, it's 1 year after the Western Balkans had first visa liberalization. And back then in the Western Balkans, there was an issue that the numbers of asylum seekers, in particular from Serbia and Macedonia, increased. So then it was installed and it became a standard procedure for any Eastern European or Western Balkan states. And it was later reformed. And the idea was from the European Union side, if the states do not continue to cooperate on return or do send or we see an increase of asylum seekers that are found to be manifestly unfounded from the states, we may reintroduce relatively quickly visa travel for the states. So it was never triggered so far, but this mechanism is intended to be a kind of a stick needed in case the EU sees an urgency for it, and states are aware that this is basically a risk in case they do not comply with the EU's condition in this sense. So this is the particular case of Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. We have only currently 3 states that are still negotiating towards visa liberalization. This is Turkey, Kosovo, and Russia. So with Russia, it's frozen as part of the sanctions. With Turkey, it's frozen because the European Parliament linked it to changes in the counterterrorism regulation. And with Kosovo, Kosovo is very complicated because some member states don't accept it as a independent state. And so Kosovo, the Commission has suggested that there should be a full visa liberalization, but it's not done. So we can see it's becoming more contested recently, but as such, this linkage between readmission and visa liberalization in Eastern Europe, Western Balkans has allowed the European Union to be relatively influential and to make them accept this kind of underlying deal in the field of return and border control. Let's move outside this field and let's go what is going on in the world, in the worldwide picture. So this is a slide that we created for research on the EU's return rate. So this is the return rate. The return rate is the rate between the orders of orders to leave European countries and the effectuated return. So return can also be done in a voluntary manner. So if migrants that are compelled to leave, then leave voluntarily, but it can also be forcible. It's the return rate is not officially calculated by the European Union, but the Commission uses it in many of its policy documents, in many decisions. It's basically a key reference point. It's very problematic in the data. In the article, we highlighted also the data issue there. But we try to mitigate them and to create a kind of a worldwide picture what's actually the return rate of the EU with the whole world. And what you can see here is that it's differentiating quite a bit. You can see that other OECD countries, they have a relatively high return rate, also in South Africa. Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, also very high. The Western Balkans in Eastern Europe sometimes, or in between, is the highest rate in the world. You have also some cases such as Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, the return rate was 100%, but there were only from 2008 to 2018, there were only about 2,200 Saudi Arabians who received an order to leave the EU, and all of them returned voluntarily. So this could also be the case. But what you can also see is that in some African regions, the return rate is really low. So it's around 10 to 15%. And what's interesting, if you look a bit longitudinally, it's actually decreasing. So it's getting lower numbers and lower numbers, regardless of the fact that the EU is actually trying to do more with the states and to make them accept more cooperation on return. The problem for the states is that it's a very salient issue. Many of these countries, they see that their populations depend on remittances sent back by migrants. It's a very salient issue in African states to cooperate with the European Union on return and border control. So the states often refuse to cooperate on readmission agreements. The European Union has only one readmission agreement with an African state. This is Cape Verde. No other African states has accepted to complete the negotiations until the end. The European Union has negotiated for years, for over 20 years, with states such as Morocco, tried to push Algeria, but it didn't go to. So what is happening, what we see in the negotiations there as well, is that the EU has basically stopped focusing on formal readmission agreements and went towards more informal readmission deals. They can have different names. They can have names that do not indicate at all that they relate to migration issues, such as the Joint Way Forward document with Afghanistan, or you will see it in the next slide. So it's relatively invisible. It's much less salient in the public spotlight. It allows also the partner countries to negotiate with the EU in a bit more in a bit more hidden way. And from the EU's perspective, it's also the advantage that the European Parliament is a bit less involved. They can be signed more informally. There's no scrutiny for the Court of Justice of the European Union. And you can see it also in particular post-migration crisis 2015, 2016. It allowed for the EU to show that they can have action in a relatively short time period. And this creates the kind of news headlines that head of states or ministers of interiors are keen to have in a perceived situation of crisis. So what does this soft law constitute? I mean, this is soft law does not create legal commitments, but it can still push actors to politically commit to a certain action. And it can also nudge member states in a particular direction of change. So it was also this readmission agreement was also intended to push certain states within the European Union to prioritize returns over other means, be it regularization or being other means. So it has this kind of internal dimension as well. And here we can see that really we have seen that soft law is getting a relatively important feature in the return field. So these are the informal readmission agreements signed in particular in the years after the crisis. So you have countries such as Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Guinea, the Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire. As I mentioned before, you don't necessarily would assume that these are migration control or return agreements if you just look at the name of them, like admission procedure, standard operation procedures, joint way forward procedure. But this should not be misleading. So this is a comparison of, for instance, the joint way forward with Afghanistan and the readmission agreement with Pakistan. So even if you have a legally non-binding agreement, you can see that this very committing in a way. In the way in the agreement with Afghanistan, it was even foreseen that the EU would finance a own kind of landing area in Kabul airport in which return flights could land. It has relatively tight time limits, and in certain aspects, it was even more demanding than readmission agreements. So it's something that should be politically committing, and that should actually lead from the European Union side to much higher return rates with countries outside Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. But in this, I'm coming back to the article that I mentioned before. So we really looked explicitly if there is any impact of the return rate if the EU signs this kind of informal or formal readmission agreements. And what we found is that the return rate hardly moved for a whole range of these countries. There was in many, if you just look at the return rates, there was no change in the return rate with several of the states that has signed these agreements. With some states, such as Afghanistan, so in Afghanistan, we could see between 2016 and 2018, you had really a temporary peak, and then it went back to the level that it used to be beforehand. Turkey, the same. So in Turkey, the EU has a readmission agreement, but the readmission agreement didn't change really the pattern of return cooperation between the EU and Turkey. So why is this so? I mean, it's probably too far-reaching to completely go in these reasons right now, but it has internal and external reasons. In the Gambia, for instance, the EU signed an agreement, and there was really a flight of returnees back to Gambia. There was unrest, there was protestations to people gathering and moving all together to the airport. So the government backtracked and made an internal memorandum not to cooperate anymore. So it could be this kind of unrest reason. In the case of Afghanistan, it was also related to EU's internal reasons. So there was a big discussion post-2016 if Afghanistan could be considered as a safe country. Some states wanted to use this joint way forward document and return as many as possible, but then you had kind of court procedures kicking in saying that it's too unsafe for Afghans to be returned. You had, like in Germany, you had a lot of political contestation of these agreements and return procedure to Afghanistan. So there was, on the European Union side, also a kind of a constraints that led to this. We can see again that basically an increase of return rate only happened in very particular circumstances, and primarily again in the kind of wider Eastern neighbors, if you want to say so, that are very interested to have closer relations with the EU for different reasons, or that we are keen to have a kind of a migration management regime close to the similar to their neighbors, such as Ukraine, so that their own citizens could get easier into the European Union. So what we can see is actually that there is a growing gap between Western Balkans and Eastern Europe and the rest of the world in return. You have the EU trying to push more and more third countries to cooperate, to negotiate, to agree on return arrangements, but de facto these arrangements, at least if measured by a return rate, they bring little changes. And what we can see really is that the return rate, it's almost always between 30 and 40%. It remained only between 30 and 40 remains because the return rates for Western Balkans and Eastern Europe increased more and more. To the rest of the world, it decreased more and more. So the gap is really getting bigger here. So this is a bit, yeah, this is still a slide I wanted to show. It was also into this very interesting report of the European Court of Auditors of the EU's return policy. So it shows you a bit the ratio between remittances and development aid that certain countries have. And you can see that for many of these countries, it's a very rational decision to resist in the negotiations with the European Union, because even if the EU or EU member states threaten to freeze development aid, the remittances of migrants, they tend to be much more important. And we can see that states such as Mali, they have chosen to accept, in this case, it was the French freezing of development aid over a migration return deal. In some countries, Gambia, again, it can be really over 20–25% of the GDP that is made up by the remittances of migrants. It's really, for the states, very, very important. Okay, what is the EU trying vis-a-vis this world? So we see here that there is a reform going on within the European Union. The EU says we have to play more hardball, if you want to say so. If the states don't cooperate, don't sign, or even if they sign, they don't follow up on these agreements, then they will have more negative consequences. This was made possible by the visa code, a reform in the visa code in 2019. So there could be restrictions for certain groups of the whole population if the cooperation on return is not going satisfactorily. And the Commission in 2020 said that this should be even more closely right now used. States that don't cooperate or negotiate on return, they will face negative consequences here. Again, Gambia, Iraq, and Bangladesh, they are the first three countries that will face this policy right now. It's under negotiation. Okay, I'm coming already to the third part of my section. So we have right now moved from the Western Balkans, Eastern Europe to the rest of the world. Right now we move into the European Union. And inside the European Union, we can also see that return is having a very, very important part in the new pact on migration and asylum that was released last year in September 2020 by the European Commission. So the European Commission said we should install a concept called return sponsorship. So how would it work principally? So it would imply that the whole or European Union member states should cooperate more closely and more intertwined in the return of migrants. Concretely, for instance, there would be a group of Nigerian migrants to be returned from Sicily. So it's not only the Italian authorities in charge, but Belgium says, okay, or the Belgian authority act as the return sponsor. So in the first period, the migrants would remain in Sicily at the EU border. The legal responsibility would remain with Italy, but the Belgium would say, what can we do? And the Italians say, for instance, yeah, please get us the laissez-faire documents, talk with the consulate of Nigeria, or finance a assisted voluntary return program, this kind of measures. There should be an EU return coordinator that is coordinating the negotiations between Belgium and Italy and should be of help there. In a first outcome, the return is possible, then the migrants are returned directly from Italy to Nigeria. To be defined how, but could be also that then Frontex is coming in and operationally helping them. Or if a return is not possible, then the migrants are brought away from Sicily and physically transferred to Belgium. So this should happen after 8 months, 4 months in case of a crisis. So it's a relatively complicated process, but also a process that is really committing to the member states. The context for why this is happening is that related to the field of asylum. Basically, in the EU, you have very diverging numbers of asylum seekers. After the crisis, the EU said we should look that it's a bit fairer and more evenly distributed in the European Union. So they came up with this idea of relocating asylum seekers in the European Union. They made an emergency relocation mechanism. But as you can see from this number, several member states were very critical towards the relocation of asylum seekers from EU border states, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia. This even, judicially contested the mechanism. They did not transfer physically any migrant there. So the Commission said, okay, these states, they don't want to relocate asylum seekers. They always call for restrictive migration policies. Let's give them responsibilities in the return field. This is clearly in the, a restrictive migration measures, and then they can show solidarity in this field. But, and here we come to the decision-making process that is going on right now in the European Union. So the EU Pact is under negotiations currently, and we can see that the return sponsorships, they more shift than end the political cleavages between Eastern, Western, and Southern member states. So you have groups that were very relocating, groups of states that were very reluctant towards relocation are very reluctant towards return sponsorship too. The Austrian minister called it relocation through the back door. On the other hand, you have the Greek, Maltese governments who say, no, 8 months is far too long. We need 3 months max, 4 months max, and then they should be brought away from our territories. Another point is here, what is going on is that member states can choose very freely what to do. They can choose solidarity, they can choose which nationalities they want to return. They can choose the mix between relocating asylum seekers and returning irregular migrants. So it's a lot of room of maneuver and a lot of, if you want to say so, room for shirking responsibilities and discussing the value of contributions. So states at the borders, they have been critical. They said we need more predictable concepts, predictable plans. What will happen with migrants in our territories? And here it's relatively open if this concept can fulfill it. Finally, something that is certainly a big concern as well is that the return sponsorship may increase the vulnerabilities of migrants. You don't have a common return regime in the European Union in the sense that it's clear, states differ in their perception of what is a safe third country. States have very different practices of returning migrants to certain countries. You have states, Denmark, for instance, that publicly announced it would start returning Syrians back to the area of Damascus in Syria. Other states refrain from doing such practices. It's also with regard to migrants' rights, there are so many actors involved that it's sometimes difficult to really establish clear lines of authorities, clear lines of accountability if something is going wrong. And finally, and here I come back to what I said before, the return sponsorship concept builds upon the idea that the return within the European Union from border states to center states will remain the exception. There should be much more return from the border to the third countries, with the EU using more conditionalities and so on. But if you look what has happened so far in the EU's negotiation with third countries, this is an optimistic assessment, an optimistic prediction, and it's questionable if more conditionalities and more pressures will lead to the outcomes that the Commission is hoping for. There are also some other aspects that can be discussed, such as, are member states willing to use the bilateral relations for the readmission of migrants from other member states? Third countries tend to view readmission with very critical eyes, and it usually negatively affects the bilateral relations. Right now, asking France to use its privileged relationship with some African states for the return of migrants from Poland, it may be a difficult thing for French authorities to do. So I'm coming to the end, deciding on return issues. So you have different settings, I would say so. In the Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, you have formal readmission cooperation in exchange for visa-free travel. There is a certain underlying bargain, you know, you accept our own citizens to be kind of equal, at least in traveling patterns. And in exchange, we accept that we are part of, you know, a migration management system that includes the return of our own nationals and stricter border controls. This is not happening in third countries. In third countries outside these settings, you tend to go more towards informal deals to reduce public salience. It has brought some results in terms of actual agreements, but the cooperation is not really followed up if you look at the real numbers of returned migrants. And then within the EU, you have right now on the basically at present ongoing very contentious negotiations on making return sponsorship as a key element of solidarity together with the relocation of asylum seekers. It's a bit of a risky bet by the European Commission because it has a risk of a continued politizations in the negotiations, and it may lead to only unsatisfactory operational outcomes. Thank you.